1 year from now, Americans will be heading back to the polls to elect their president for the next 4 years. It's looking highly likely that Joe Biden and Donald Trump will be going head-to-head once again, with each candidate bringing their own unique agenda to the table. The key to turning their plans into actions lies in securing control of Congress. My name is Sam Furlonger. I work in the client group at Schroders. I'm joined by George Brown, economist here at Schroders. We'll be looking into the implications that the election will have on the economy and various asset classes. We'll look to gain a deeper understanding of the dynamics at play in this highly anticipated political event. So George, why is it so uncertain that Joe Biden will be re-elected?
Well, I think Biden will be asking him the same question because if you, for most presidents, you'd give your right arm to be in Biden's shoes right now because he's got all the ingredients needed for a successful re-election bid. So first off, of course, he's got the incumbency advantage, but the second point is that he's also got a very strong economy with low unemployment. And on top of that, you've had rising geopolitical tensions, first in Ukraine, now obviously in Israel, which typically lead to a rally round the flag effect. But despite all these favourable factors, he's deeply unpopular amongst the electorate. And there's a whole host of reasons why that is the case. But the key issue from at the moment seems to be his age. He was 78 years old when he first entered the White House. That was made him the oldest president in history. And if he was to see out a second term, that would take him through to being 86 years old.
Wow.
And that shows really in the polls in terms of the concerns of voters, because there was one poll that asked voters, what are the first words that spring to mind when you think about Joe Biden? 1 in 4 voters said it was old, elderly, or outdated. And that compares with just 1 in 100 for Donald Trump, even though he's just 3 years younger. So it's clear that Biden does have this issue with his age, and he's trying to shift that image amongst voters. He's used humor in a lot of his recent press conferences and events to try and deflect those kind of concerns about his age. He jokes about it quite a lot, how old he is. But it's not really working. It's not really gaining traction. And it's something he's really going to have to get on top of if he wants to win the next election, because at the moment it's costing him a lot of votes.
So many thought Trump was written off after the Capitol riots, but he looks to be the next Republican candidate. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, well, if you look at a lot of the media right now, they're sort of treating it as if the race has already been won before it's really begun. And don't get me wrong, I do think that Trump will be the next Republican nominee, but I just don't think it's necessarily a done deal, as some would have you believe. And that's because, even though he's got this strong lead over his competitors, he's got a 40-point lead over his closest one, which is Ron DeSantis. You only have to go back to 1999 under George Bush Jr. At this stage, he had an even bigger lead of about 50 points over John McCain. Now, a lot of the media at the time thought it was going to be a clear route to victory, but actually what happened was the primary battle ended up being quite scrappy, and it ended up being quite tumultuous. And so, and it was actually make or break at certain points for him. So I would say, first off, a strong lead doesn't guarantee you success. But the second thing as well, that unlike Bush Jr. back in 1999, Trump has a lot of other distractions, largely on the legal front. And they're really set to keep him off the campaign trail as we go into the primary season next year. And that starts off really on the 14th of January. He's got the defamation trial in New York. That coincides with the First in the Nation caucuses in Iowa. But then the real headache for him starts on the 4th of March when he's due in court over his alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. And that's because that coincides with Super Tuesday, which is when 13 states will vote on who they want their Republican nominee to be. So I would say, yes, it does look like Trump will be the nominee, but I just wouldn't take anything for granted at this stage. And I wouldn't rule out it being somebody else up against Biden next year, whether that's Ron DeSantis or perhaps someone like Nikki Haley instead.
So how would a Biden-Trump election potentially affect investors and various asset classes?
Well, I think it's difficult to say at this stage, given that, of course, we're about a year away from the election. So they haven't sort of set down their policies in stone, as it were. But I think if we start with Biden, I think if Biden was to be re-elected, he'd probably look to resurrect parts of his Build Back Better agenda, of which about $2 trillion was never implemented. But I think if he were to try and do that, I think there'd be greater concerns amongst fiscal sustainability amongst investors. And what that'll probably mean is higher yields as a consequence. Alongside that as well, I think Biden might try to raise the top rates of corporation tax, income tax, as well as capital gains taxes, and possibly even tighter regulation in certain sectors such as banking or healthcare. And I think those factors could weigh on risk assets to some degree. But if we take a Trump presidency, on the other hand, obviously he's considered the more probably pro-business candidate out of the two. And I think that if he were to be elected, perhaps we could see risk assets perform much better as a consequence. But I think investors are going to have to weigh that up against what possibly his foreign policy agenda is going to be. So there is a risk, I guess, that he might further isolate the US from its allies, particularly on the situation of Russia, particularly if you was to scale back some of the sanctions, for instance. And I suppose the big question of all is, will he be convicted of a crime? Will he be incarcerated? Those are still questions that are going to be looming for the next year, maybe 2 years. Because if he were to be incarcerated and to be president, of course, that would be an unprecedented situation. It would probably lead to a constitutional battle, and it could even lead to some insurrection. So I think from an investor perspective, we should be prepared for volatility. And in that environment, you'd expect safe haven bond yields to do quite well, like bunds or maybe Japanese government bonds, JGBs, or perhaps even gold.
So House and Senate elections are obviously going to take place next year as well. How important are they?
So a lot of the focus is, of course, on the presidential race, and probably rightly so. But at the same time, as you say, there is going to be the Senate and House elections. And I think they're equally as important as the presidential race, because even if Biden or Trump were to secure victory, it will be a fairly hollow one if they can't manage to control Congress, because it'll effectively mean that any legislative policies that they want to enact will be dead on arrival, as it were. So if we take the Senate, for instance, there are 34 seats up for grabs out of the 100, and 3 of those are currently toss-ups. And the 3 toss-ups are all within the Democratic caucus in the Senate. And so you could have a scenario where Biden wins the presidency, but he also loses the Senate, and obviously he struggles to enact legislation as a consequence. But likewise, if Donald Trump was elected president, it's looking very likely he would lose the popular vote for the 3rd time, and as a consequence, they could lose the Republican majority in the House, and so likewise, he would really struggle to enact any legislation either. But that should really be good news for investors, because deadlock, effectively, from a legislative perspective, forces compromise amongst the parties. It helps to moderate the more extreme inclinations of both parties. And so what you typically get is a better backdrop for investors. And you see that in terms of equities. So equities have historically seen average annual returns of 13.4% under a divided Congress, whereas under a united government, you've seen more moderate gains of about 13%. But I think the real split happens when you look at it on a party basis. So if you've got a Democrat in the White House, but a divided Congress or divided government, we typically see average annual gains of 18.8%, whereas it's just 12% for their Republican counterparts. So in answer to your question, I do think the House and Senate races matter, and I think they're just as important as the presidential race.
So George, thank you very much for that. If you were to give the top 3 takeaways from this discussion to the people listening, what would those 3 be?
Well, I suppose my first top takeaway would be that there's still 1 year to go in the election. Anything could happen. And so anything could happen, and don't rule anything out. I suppose my second top takeaway would be that the House and the Senate elections are just as important as the presidential race. So do keep an eye on those battleground states, because they will make all the difference. And the third and final point is that the election will matter for markets next year. It will be a big driver of sentiment for investors. And so be prepared for volatility. And the best way we can do that as investors is to make sure that we have liquid, balanced portfolios. And that will help you to navigate the twists and the turns of the race next year.
Thanks, George. I hope you all found that useful. This is going to be a topic that we're going to be covering quite a lot over the coming years, so please do keep an eye out for further content. And thanks very much for listening.